Maggie Calloway broke the last bread heel in half with her bare hands, placed one piece in front of each son, and smiled like it was the finest meal in the county. Her hands were shaking. Her boys didn't notice. They never did. That was the night Elias Holt's horse stopped at the wrong moment, and he saw through the gap in those warped boards what no man was meant to witness, and it changed everything. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel, drop your city in the comments, so I can see how far this tale has traveled, and stay with us until the very last word. You won't want to leave. The bread heel made a dry, hollow sound when Maggie Calloway set it on the crate they used as a table. She'd been saving it since morning, wrapping it in the only clean cloth she owned, keeping it away from the cold that crept through the warped boards of the shack like an uninvited guest that never left. Outside, the wind off the Wyoming plain had teeth. Inside, two small boys sat waiting with the patience that only hunger teaches children. Tom was 10. He sat straight-backed, hands folded in his lap, watching his mother with eyes that had gone old too fast. Hank was 6, and he still swung his feet when he sat still, hummed little nothing songs under his breath, still believed whatever his mother told him about the world. Tom had stopped believing some things. He just didn't say so. Maggie broke the bread heel in half. The crust crumbled at the edges. She arranged both pieces on the tin plate like they were something precious, because to her they were. She'd scraped the last of the bacon grease from the pan 3 days ago. The potatoes were gone. What remained was this 2 small pieces of stale bread, a handful of potato peelings she'd boiled soft, and a mother's absolute refusal to let her sons see her fall apart. "There now," she said, and her voice came out warm and steady as a church bell. "A good supper for my good boys." Tom looked at the plate. He looked at his mother. "Mama, you ain't eating." "I had plenty earlier, sweet boy. This is all for you too." Hank grabbed his piece and took a bite. His eyes closed like it tasted wonderful. Maybe to him it did. He was 6, and his mother had told him it was good, and he trusted her the way only a 6-year-old can trust his mother completely, without condition, without the shadow of doubt that age drops into a person's heart. Tom didn't eat. He kept watching her. "You're lying," he said quietly. No accusation in it. Just the flat, sad truth of a boy who'd been watching his mother lie to protect him for 11 months straight. Thomas Calloway. "You ain't eaten since yesterday morning. Maybe before." He pushed his bread back toward her. "Take half." "I will not." "Mama." "Tom." Her voice dropped. Just one word, but it carried everything. It carried his dead father's name buried in the churchyard up north. It carried the 2-day wagon ride south on the money they had left. It carried every morning she'd woken before dawn to take in mending from women who paid late if they paid at all. It carried the shame of the church lady's basket left on the porch last Christmas that she'd thanked them for and then cried over for an hour after they left because it came with eyes that watched and mouths that talked. That one word, his name, carried all of it, and he heard every bit. He picked up his bread. He ate it slow, not tasting it, watching her smile. That was the meal Elias Holt saw through the gap in the shack's warped wallboards. He hadn't meant to look. He'd reined his horse on the edge of the road because the animal had gone lame on a stone, and he'd stopped to check the shoe, and the lamplight had flickered through the slats at exactly the wrong angle, or the right one. He still wasn't sure which. He straightened up from checking the hoof and saw her. Saw the tin plate. Saw the bread. Saw the 2 boys, one eating one, arguing both too thin. Saw Maggie Calloway smile like there was nothing in the world wrong, while her hands shook so hard the plate rattled against the crate. Elias Holt was not a man given to public feeling. He'd built the largest cattle operation in 3 counties through silence and stubbornness, and the ability to work 18 hours without complaint. He'd buried his wife Clara 6 years ago and taught himself not to weep in front of the hands. He handled rattlesnakes and bank negotiations and drought with the same flat, controlled face. Men respected him for it. Some were afraid of him for it. He stood in the dark beside his horse on the frozen road and his throat closed like a fist had wrapped around it and squeezed. He knew that meal. He knew it the way you know a nightmare you've had so many times, it's left marks. He'd been 8 years old the winter his own mother divided a single cold potato between the two of them, and called it supper, and sang while she did it. He knew the way hunger looked on a mother's face when she thought her children couldn't see that particular expression that was equal parts love and terror and determination, all of it held together by sheer will. He'd spent 30 years trying to bury that winter. He'd built his ranch up from 40 acres and 3 cows, and the stubbornness of a man who had decided poverty was something that had happened to him once, but would not happen again. He had storerooms full of cured meat and barrels of flour and a root cellar packed tight against the hard months. He had more than he could use, more than one man, and a hired housekeeper, and a handful of ranch hands could eat in 2 winters. He stood there, watching a woman feed her sons bread crusts and pretend it was a feast, and he could not move. Hank laughed at something. The sound came through the boards clear and bright, a little boy's laugh, easy and pure. Maggie's face changed when she heard it. Something in her released some tightened thing, and she laughed too quiet and real and pulled him against her side and kissed the top of his head. Elias turned his horse and rode home without making a sound. He didn't eat supper. His housekeeper, Clara Webb, had set out roasted beef and beans and cornbread and a jar of preserved plums, and he sat at the long table in his empty dining room and looked at it and pushed it away. "Mr. Holt." Clara appeared in the doorway. She was 62 years old and had worked for him 4 years and had learned to read him the way old ranch women learn to read weather. "Something wrong with the food." "Food's fine." He stood up. "I'm not hungry." She didn't argue. She'd learned that too. He went to his study and sat by the window in the dark and thought about a tin plate and a broken bread heel and a boy who said his mother was lying and a mother who looked him in the eye and held her smile together with both hands. He was at Mercer's general store before it opened the next morning. Walt Mercer found him waiting on the steps when he came to unlock saddlebags over his shoulder and had the good sense not to ask questions. Elias bought eggs packed in straw, a 10-pound sack of flour, bacon, salt pork, 6 potatoes without a soft spot among them, 2 tins of milk, dried apples, a small twist of sugar. He paid without comment and loaded everything into the largest wicker basket he owned, wrapped it in clean cloth, and tied it with twine. No note. He thought about a note and decided against it. A note made it about him. This wasn't about him. The sky was black and starless when he saddled his horse. The cold was the killing kind, the kind that finds the gaps in your coat and settles in your bones and stays. He took back roads he'd never used before, came around to the shack from the east where the alley ran between 2 empty lots and nobody would be stirring yet. Her chimney was cold. No smoke. She was conserving wood, stretching every stick of it the way she stretched everything else. The thought put a tension in his jaw that didn't leave. He dismounted quiet. Set the basket on the doorstep, adjusting the cloth against the wind. His hands were shaking, though he told himself it was the cold. He stood there one moment too long, staring at the basket on her porch, and then he went back to his horse and rode home. He was unsaddling in the barn when the sun came up. He stood a while in the growing light, listening to the horses shift in their stalls, and thought about the sack of flour that had appeared on his mother's porch. The winter he was 8. No note, no name, just 50 pounds of flour that had kept them alive until the spring thaw brought work. He'd spent 20 years wondering who left it. He'd spent 30 more, hoping he'd become the kind of man who could do the same for someone else. Grady Sims. His foreman found him still standing in the barn an hour later. Grady was 60, leather-faced, and had worked cattle in 4 territories. He didn't say anything, just came and stood beside him and waited. "You need something, Grady?" "Nope." The old man pulled his hat down. "You look like a man thinking hard thoughts is all." "I'm fine." Grady looked at him sideways. Ain't said you wasn't. He walked out. Elias stood there a while longer. Then he went into work. He made his inquiries careful over the next 2 days. Walt Mercer sorted coffee tins and talked without much prompting. Calloway widow moved here last spring after her husband died. Lumber accident up in Montana. Heard she had family somewhere south, but none I know of here. She comes in for day-old bread when she has coin. Proud woman. Pays what she owes. At the feed store he got the rest from a man named Reed who talked too much and thought too little. That widow on Crane Street 3-4 months behind on what little rent she owes. Hollis, who owns the shack, and I use the word generously, he's been patient. Won't be patient much longer, word is. She takes in mending, but there ain't enough of that work in a town this size to keep 2 boys fed. Elias bought seed he didn't need and left. That night, he sat in his study with a lamp burning and did the arithmetic that a man like him does when he finds a problem that has a solution. She needed money. She had skills. The basket came back every morning with the cloth folded flat and precise, the wicker scrubbed. She had more dignity in her worn-out dress than most women he'd met in their Sunday best. What she didn't have was time to turn those things into enough income to outpace what was happening to her. He kept the baskets going. Every morning, pre-dawn back roads, no note. On the 4th morning, the basket came back with a wild violet tucked in the handle. A single flower, small and frost-edged, found God knows where, in the frozen creek banks. He held it in his rough hand for a long moment, standing in the cold barn, and didn't quite know what to do with the feeling it gave him. He pressed it flat between the pages of his Bible. He didn't examine why. Tom found the basket on the 5th morning. He was the one who opened the door before dawn to check the cold, his habit Elias would learn later. Something he'd started doing to make sure the wind hadn't knocked loose any of the rags they'd stuffed into the wall gaps to keep the worst of the weather out. The boy stood on the porch in the gray dark holding a basket full of food and couldn't make a sound for almost a full minute. Maggie appeared in the doorway behind him, hair-loose shawl pulled tight. She saw the basket. She saw Tom's face. She put her hand on his shoulder, and he turned into her, and she held on, and neither of them said a word for a long time. Inside, she unpacked it on the crate table with both boys watching. Tom sat very still. Hank bounced on his heels and named every item like it was being introduced: the eggs, the flour, the bacon, the potatoes, the dried apples. "Who left it, Mama?" Hank asked. "Someone kind," she said. "Why?" "Because some people in this world are good, Hank, and sometimes goodness comes from where you don't expect it." She looked at the small twist of sugar and pressed her lips together hard before she spoke again. "Now, what do you say we have a proper breakfast?" Tom didn't say anything. He picked up an egg and turned it over in his hands like it was made of glass. The 2nd week, Elias carved a wooden horse and left it nestled in the potatoes. He'd done it at midnight, sitting at his workbench with a lamp and a block of pine and a small knife, working until the shape was smooth and the grain showed clean. He didn't think too hard about why he did it. He just did it. 2 days later, Hank named the horse Thunder. Elias learned this the way he was learning everything, through fragments. He'd stopped to water his horse at the edge of town and heard the boy running with 2 other children holding the carved horse above his head, making it gallop through the air, shouting its name. He turned his horse the other direction before anyone could see him watching. Sunday, he saw her at church. The Calloways sat in the second-to-last pew, boys on either side of Maggie, all 3 of them scrubbed and neat in clothes that had been mended so many times the original fabric was more patch than garment. She held her head level and her shoulders back, and sang the hymns in a voice that was clear and unself-conscious and true. Tom held the hymn book for her. Hank leaned against her arm and watched the Reverend with round, serious eyes. Elias arrived earlier the following Sunday. He told himself it was because Grady needed the wagon that morning, and the timing was different. He sat where he could see the door. Clara Webb noticed. She said nothing until Thursday, setting his breakfast down with the particular quiet that meant she was deciding whether to speak. Then she spoke. "You've been different lately, Mr. Holt." He looked up from his coffee. "How so?" "Lighter." She refilled his cup. "Can't say more than that, just lighter." He didn't answer. She didn't push. On the morning of the third week, he arrived too early. The sky was still more black than gray, and he'd misjudged the time riding fast to beat the dawn, and he'd set the basket on the step and was turning back to his horse when the door opened. He froze. Maggie Calloway stood in the doorway in her nightgown and a wool shawl, barefoot on the frozen porch boards, squinting into the dark. He was 6 feet from her. He had about 2 seconds before the growing gray light would show his face clearly. He dropped down behind his horse, pressed his back against the animal's flank. His heart was hammering so hard he was certain she could hear it. She stood on the porch. She looked left and right. Then she looked at the basket. She bent and lifted it with both hands and pulled back the cloth, and the sound she made, a small, soft, involuntary sound, barely audible, hit him somewhere underneath his sternum and stayed there. She carried the basket inside. The door closed. Elias stood up from behind his horse in the growing dawn, legs stiff from crouching, hat. Crooked dignity somewhat compromised, and stood there in the alley catching his breath. He'd seen her face when she opened that cloth. He'd seen what relief looked like on a face that had been holding itself together for too long. Not performed gratitude, real relief, the private kind. The kind a person shows only when they believe no one is looking. The kind that bypasses every careful defense and comes straight from the place where the fear lives. She was not a charity case. She was not a duty. She was a woman who had taken every blow this hard life had thrown at her, and was still standing still, feeding her boys, still teaching them to be good, even when the world was giving her every reason to be bitter. He rode home in the growing light, and knew with the quiet certainty of a man who doesn't lie to himself that something had shifted permanently inside him, and that nothing about the next weeks or months would be simple, and that he was already too far in to turn back, even if he'd wanted to. He did not want to. The note came on the 18th morning, tucked in the returned basket. The paper was rough, the handwriting careful and slow, the handwriting of someone who hadn't had much practice. He stood in the barn and read it twice. To my unknown friend, you have kept us. I do not know how to say what this has meant, except to say that my boys are sleeping full for the first time in months, and I have cried more tears of gratitude than I knew I had in me. God knows who you are, even if I do not. May He return to you everything you have given us 1,000 times over. With all that I have, which is only this, thanks, M. He folded the note and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, against his chest, and wore it there all day. That evening, Grady found him sitting on the fence rail of the north pasture at sundown, which was not where a rancher sat, unless something was heavy on his mind. Grady leaned on the fence beside him, and they watched the last of the light leave the sky together. "Boss," Grady said after a while, "don't. Ain't said a word yet. You were about to." The old man was quiet for a moment. "Woman in town," he said. Not a question. Elias said nothing. Grady pushed off the fence. "Well," he said, "reckon you'll figure it." He walked back toward the bunkhouse and left Elias alone with the darkening sky and the note folded against his heart, and the particular weight of a man who has been alone a long time and has just begun to understand what that costs. The stars came out one by one. The ranch below him was prosperous and quiet and completely, entirely empty. He stayed on the fence rail until the cold drove him in. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, the way most trouble does, quiet, unremarkable, wearing the face of ordinary conversation. Elias had gone to Mercer's for coffee and come out with coffee and 3 pounds of smoked sausage and a wedge of hard cheese and a tin of molasses, none of which he'd intended to buy when he walked in. Walt Mercer had tallied it all without comment, but Agnes Pruitt had been standing at the fabric counter not 6 feet away, and Agnes Pruitt had the ears of a barn cat and the mouth of a river that didn't know how to stop running. He didn't think anything of it. He loaded the goods tied off his saddlebag and rode back to the ranch. By Thursday, Grady was waiting for him at the barn door with his hat in his hands, which was never a good sign. "Boss?" The old man turned the hat brim through his fingers. "Hearing some talk in town. Thought you ought to know before it got louder." Elias pulled the saddle. "What kind of talk?" "Agnes Pruitt kind." Grady set his hat back on his head. "She's been telling it around that you've been buying supplies no bachelor rancher would need. Eggs and flour and sausage and such. People are putting things together. Let them put. Some are saying you've got a woman somewhere you're keeping quiet. Others are saying—" Grady paused. "Others are saying it's the Calloway widow, that you've been helping her without telling nobody." Elias hung the saddle on its rack. He didn't answer. "Divided opinions on it," Grady continued. "Some folks think it's a decent Christian thing. Others are saying it ain't proper. Wealthy man, young widow, nobody knowing about it." He cleared his throat. "Agnes Pruitt is firmly in the second camp, in case you were wondering. I wasn't." Elias picked up a curry comb and started working the horse down. "People can think what they like." Grady watched him a moment. "It's the widow who'll catch the worst of it, boss. You know that. Man like you talk rolls off. Woman like her." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Elias worked the comb in long, slow strokes and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "I know." Grady nodded once and left. That night, Elias sat at his desk and stared at the filled basket sitting by the door, ready for the morning run, and thought about what his foreman had said. He knew Grady was right. He'd known it somewhere underneath everything, the way you know a thing you don't want to look at directly. The whispers wouldn't touch him. He was Elias Holt, 300 acres largest cattle operation in the county, 30 years of reputation, built stone by stone. Gossip bounced off men like him. It didn't bounce off women like Maggie Calloway. It stuck to them and stayed and gathered more to itself until it became something heavier than it started. He left the basket where it was. He went to bed. He didn't sleep. In the morning, the basket was still by the door. He stood looking at it in the gray pre-dawn and made himself think clearly, the way he thought about a bad debt or a failing water source, without sentiment, just facts. The facts were she needed the food. The boys needed it. Stopping would hurt them. Continuing would start a different kind of hurt. There was no version of this that didn't cost someone something. He picked up the basket and rode out. But he took the long way. All back roads, all shadow everything careful and hidden. And he hated himself a little for the hiding even as he did it. The basket came back that afternoon with two things tucked inside. The first was a piece of paper torn from what looked like a flour sack, with 3 words written on it in Tom's careful hand. "Thank you, sir." The second was a small drawing, Hank's work unmistakably, all bright impossible colors of 2 figures standing side by side, one tall and one small, holding hands. Elias looked at it a long time. He put it in his desk drawer with the other drawings, and the pressed violet and Maggie's note. Sunday came. He went to church as he always did, arriving early, settling in his usual pew 3 rows from the front. The Calloways came in just before the service started. Tom holding the door for his mother, Hank, pressing close to her side. Maggie wore her same faded dress mended along the left shoulder in a thread that almost but didn't quite match, and she walked down the aisle with her chin level and her eyes forward and her hand resting light on Hank's shoulder. She slid into the second-to-last pew. She settled her boys on either side of her. She folded her hands in her lap. Reverend Samuel Cross delivered his sermon on the parable of the loaves and fishes, which Elias thought was either a coincidence or Providence having itself a moment of dark humor. He heard approximately a third of it. The rest of the time, his attention kept drifting to the second-to-last pew without his permission. Afterward, in the yard, he was shaking the Reverend's hand when Cross held on a half-second longer than necessary and said low and careful, "Mr. Holt, might I have a word?" They walked to the side of the church where the oak tree threw shade, and the crowd noise dropped to a murmur. Cross was a thoughtful man, not unkind, but shaped by the opinions of his congregation, the way all ministers were, whether they admitted it or not. "I want you to know, "I give these rumors no credence personally," the Reverend began, "but I feel it's my responsibility to tell me what people are saying." Elias kept his voice even. "I already know what people are saying." "Then you understand my concern." Cross pressed his hands together. "A man of your standing, helping a young widow privately, without the knowledge or oversight of the church board, it creates an impression that I'm not sure serves either of you well. If you feel moved to assist Mrs. Calloway, perhaps the proper channel would be the church board." Elias looked at him steadily. "The same board that sent her a Christmas basket last year with 3 women attached to it, who talked about it in the fabric store for 6 weeks afterward." Cross blinked. "I wasn't aware." She knew it too. Elias pulled his hat on. "She thanked them polite, and then she went home and told her boys God provided, and didn't mention the 3 women who watched her face while she opened it. That's what your proper channels feel like from where she's standing, Reverend." He walked away before the conversation could go any further. He shouldn't have said it. He knew that before he'd finished saying it. Not because it was wrong, it wasn't wrong, but because it would travel. Cross was a decent man, but he had a wife who talked to Agnes Pruitt twice a week over a shared fence line. The basket didn't reach the Calloway doorstep the following morning. He'd risen before dawn as always. He'd filled the basket. He'd stood in his kitchen in the lamplight, holding it in both hands, and stood there for a long time, Grady's words running through his head. "It's the widow who'll catch the worst of it, boss," and set it back down on the table. He made himself a pot of coffee. He drank it standing up, looking out the kitchen window at the dark. He thought about the way Tom had said his mother was lying quiet and flat and sad with all the love in the world behind it. He thought about Hank naming the carved horse Thunder and running with it through the streets like it was the finest thing he owned. He thought about the note pressed flat in the cloth. He thought about Maggie's face in the lamplight, dividing nothing into 2 careful portions and calling it plenty. He picked up the basket again. He set it down again. This went on for an hour. Then 2. Grady found him still standing in the kitchen at full sunrise, with the basket on the table and a look on his face that the old foreman would later describe to his wife as a man fighting himself and losing to both sides. "Boss," Grady said from the doorway. "You eatin'?" "No." "You going to?" "Probably not." Grady came in, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table without being invited, which he'd never done before in 4 years of working the Holt Ranch. He sat across from the basket and looked at it, and looked at Elias. "You stop," Grady said. "Those boys go back to empty. You keep on, the talk gets worse for her." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Ain't a clean answer." "I know. What are you going to do about it?" Elias picked up the basket. "I haven't decided yet." Grady watched him walk out to the barn. He didn't follow. Maggie had known something was different that morning, before she opened the door. It was the particular quality of the silence, not the ordinary silence of early morning, but something heavier, something with an absence in it. She'd been awake since 4, lying in the curtained corner she used as her bedroom, listening to the boys breathe in their sleep, and doing the arithmetic she did every morning before she allowed herself to think about anything else. What remained? What was owed? How far it stretched? She opened the door, and the doorstep was bare. She stood there in the cold in her stocking feet and looked at the empty boards for a long time. The cold came up through the wool and into the soles of her feet, and she didn't move. Tom appeared behind her. He looked past her at the empty step and said nothing. He just came and stood beside her in the doorway, shoulder almost reaching hers, and they looked at the empty doorstep together in the quiet. "Maybe tomorrow," she said. Tom didn't answer. She made the boys pancakes from the last of the flour and didn't eat herself and smiled through breakfast while Hank talked about what he and Thunder had done yesterday. Thunder had jumped a creek apparently and won a race and was generally the bravest horse in Wyoming. Tom ate his pancakes carefully, like he was rationing them, which he was. He'd learned that from watching her. After breakfast, Maggie sat at the crate table, with her mending in her lap, and made herself be practical. She still had eggs. She had a half jar of dried beans. She had more than she'd had 6 weeks ago before the baskets started coming because she'd been careful stretching what the baskets brought, saving a little against the day they stopped. She'd known, hadn't she, that they would stop. Everything stopped eventually. She'd known it and saved against it, and she would be all right. She set a stitch and broke the thread and started again. She would be all right. They would be all right. She'd managed before some anonymous soul started leaving abundance on her doorstep, and she would manage after. She was Margaret Calloway, and she did not fall apart over empty doorsteps. She set another stitch. The thread broke again. She put the mending down and covered her face with her hands and sat there in the silence for exactly 60 seconds, letting herself feel the weight of it. The fear and the exhaustion and the loneliness and the particular grief of something good being taken away. She let herself feel all of it for 60 seconds. Then she picked the mending back up and began again. She didn't hear the gossip until Wednesday when she went to Mercer's for thread. She'd been putting it off because every penny she spent on thread was a penny that didn't go to the rent Hollis was already carrying for her out of the patience that she knew wouldn't last much longer. She'd gone in with exact coin and a specific list and the intention of being in and out in under 5 minutes. Agnes Pruitt and a woman Maggie didn't know well were at the fabric counter with their backs half turned and their voices were pitched at that particular volume that means a person wants to be heard without being seen to intend it. Mercer says he's been buying eggs and flour and such regular, Agnes was saying. More than a bachelor man needs by far. And everyone knows he's been slipping out before sunrise on the back roads. A pause waited with implication. Well, we all know what kind of woman receives a man's charity in secret. Maggie stood in the middle of the store with her coin in her fist. The widow you think, the other woman said. Who else? Poor as church mice, those boys half-starved. A rich man feeling generous, and a woman desperate enough to... Mrs. Pruitt. Walt Mercer's voice came from behind the counter, flat and deliberate. You need anything else today, or are you about done? The women went quiet. Maggie walked to the counter and set her coin down and said, Thread, please, brown if you have it, and kept her voice completely steady and her eyes on the counter. Walt wrapped the thread without a word. He met her eyes when he handed it across. You have a good day, Mrs. Calloway, he said, and the way he said it told her he'd heard everything and was sorry and didn't know what else to offer. Thank you, Mr. Mercer. She took the thread. She walked out. She made it to the alley beside the hardware store before her legs went uncertain beneath her and she had to put one hand against the wall and breathe. Not because of what Agnes Pruitt had said about her, she'd expected that had known it was coming had braced for it. Because of what it meant for her unknown friend. Whoever had been leaving those baskets would know by now that the town was talking, that the kindness they'd offered in secret had become gossip, that their good name was being attached to hers in the ugliest possible way. That was why the basket had stopped. She straightened up. She removed her hand from the wall. She walked home. She did not cry. She'd decided some months ago that crying was a luxury she couldn't afford during daylight hours when the boys might see. She saved it for after they were asleep, quiet and careful, into her pillow, so the sound wouldn't carry through the thin curtain. She'd gotten very efficient at it. That night after Tom and Hank were asleep, she lay in her curtained corner and thought about whoever it was who had kept them. All those mornings. The eggs packed so careful in straw so not a one would break. The dried apples. The small twist of sugar that had made Hank's eyes go wide. The wooden horse sanded smooth that Tom had run his thumb over slow before passing it to his little brother without being asked. Whoever this person was, they had seen her. Really seen her, not the widow everyone pitied, not the object of charity, and they had acted not out of condescension, but out of some private understanding that she couldn't quite name. And now the town's ugliness had driven that person away, and she would spend the rest of her life never knowing who to thank. She turned her face into the pillow. In the morning she opened the door before she let herself hope. The basket was there. She sat down on the step in the cold and pressed both hands over her mouth and shook. Not from grief this time. From something she didn't have a name for, the particular feeling of discovering that someone chose you anyway, knowing the cost. Tom appeared behind her. He looked at the basket. He looked at his mother sitting on the step with her hands over her mouth. He sat down beside her and leaned his shoulder against hers, and didn't say anything because Tom Calloway understood at 10 years old that some moments didn't need words, just presence. They sat on the step in the cold morning together, mother and son, and looked at the basket and breathed. Inside the cloth underneath the eggs and the flour and the salt pork, Hank found a second wooden carving. A small bird wings, spread grain showing clean in the wood, smooth as river stone. He held it up and looked at it and said with complete certainty, "This one's called Hope." Maggie heard him say it from across the room and had to turn away and look at the wall for a moment before she could trust her face again. Tom picked up the bird after Hank had set it down and turned it over in his hands. He looked at his mother's back. He looked at the door. He was 10 years old, and he'd spent the better part of a year watching his mother carry more than one person was built to carry, and he had his father's habit of going very still and quiet when he was working something through. "Mama," he said. She turned around. "When we find out who it is," he said, careful and measured, like he was announcing something decided, "I'm going to shake his hand." She looked at her son, his father's jaw, her own eyes, the particular dignity of a child who had learned too young that the world was hard and had decided to be good anyway, and she said, "So am I, baby, so am I." The fourth week brought a thaw that nobody trusted. The ice on the creek edges softened during the days and refroze harder at night, which was the kind of false spring that Wyoming delivered as a reminder that the land didn't owe you anything and never had. Elias worked the ranch through it with the particular intensity of a man who has too much going on inside his head and is using his hands to manage it. He mended fence that didn't need mending. He reorganized the tack room twice. He rode the north pasture checking cattle that Grady had already checked and found nothing wrong with them, which he'd known before he rode out. Clara Webb watched him from the kitchen window and said nothing. She'd worked for enough solitary men to know the difference between a man who wanted to be left alone and a man who was alone and didn't want to be anymore. Elias Holt had crossed from one into the other sometime in the last month, and the crossing had left marks on him that showed in the set of his shoulders and the way he sat at supper, staring at the far wall instead of his plate. She set an extra piece of cornbread on his plate Tuesday evening without comment. He ate it without noticing. She considered that progress. The trouble with Hollis came to Elias's attention on a Thursday through Grady, which was how most things came to him, filtered through his foreman's flat delivery and careful silencing of anything that wasn't essential. "That shack on Crane Street," Grady said while they were pulling tack. "Word is Hollis has lost patience. Told the widow she's got 2 weeks to make good on 4 months of back rent or he's putting her out." Elias stopped what he was doing. "How much?" $12, give or take." It wasn't a large sum for a man like Elias. It was an impossible sum for a woman taking in mending in a town this size. They both knew it without saying it. "She know yet?" Elias asked. "Hollis went by yesterday afternoon. Boys were home." She had to hear it in front of them. Grady's jaw tightened slightly, which was as close to visible anger as he got. "Way I heard it, Tom stepped between his mother and Hollis when Hollis started raising his voice. 10-year-old boy. Hollis backed off. But 2 weeks is 2 weeks." Elias walked to the barn door and stood there looking out at nothing for a moment. "You hear this from a reliable source." "Walt Mercer. He's reliable." 2 weeks. Elias turned it over. He could pay the rent anonymously, leave the money somewhere no name same as the baskets. But $12 appearing from nowhere would raise exactly the kind of talk that had already started circling. And it solved 1 month. Next month, Hollis would be back. The month after that. The mending work wouldn't stretch to cover rent on top of food, not in a town this size, not with 2 growing boys. He went back to work and didn't say anything else about it, and Grady knew him well enough not to ask. That night, Elias sat at his desk with his ledger open in front of him, and didn't look at the ledger. He looked at the desk drawer where the drawings were. He opened it and spread them out on the blotter, the crayon house, with the impossible Smoke the Stick Figure family, with Maggie's arms stretched wide enough to hold both boys the bold scrawl of Hank's handwriting on the back of the last one. Our friend. He'd spelled it wrong, and it was the best thing Elias had read in years. He thought about Tom stepping between his mother and a grown man raising his voice, 10 years old, 10, standing his ground, his father's instinct working through him, even though his father had been gone 11 months. He thought about Maggie having to hold herself together in front of her sons, while Hollis told her she was 2 weeks from the street, and then holding herself together after Hollis left too, because there was no moment when Maggie Calloway got to stop holding herself together. He put the drawings back. He closed the drawer. He went to bed. He lay there in the dark for an hour. Then he got up, went to his desk, and wrote 2 letters. The first was to his lawyer in Cheyenne. The second he sealed and didn't reread because if he reread it, he'd talk himself out of it. He rode to town early the next morning. He mailed both letters at the post office before he could change his mind, and then he stood on the post office steps in the cold and accepted that the thing he'd just set in motion couldn't be unmoved. What happened next happened because he misjudged the morning by 20 minutes. He'd been running these basket deliveries at what he believed was a consistent pre-dawn window, dark enough that the street was empty, early enough that Maggie and the boys were still asleep. He'd been wrong about this. It turned out for at least the last week. Tom Calloway was an early riser, and an early riser with a protective instinct got up before dawn to listen for sounds that shouldn't be there. The boy had heard him 3 mornings running soft boots on frozen ground, the particular sound of a basket being set careful on wooden boards. Elias learned this the hard way on a Friday morning when he placed the basket on the step and straightened up and found himself looking at Tom Calloway, standing in the open doorway in his nightshirt with a lamp in his hand and his father's eyes in his face. They looked at each other. The boy looked at him, looked at the basket, looked back at him. His expression went through several things in quick succession: surprise, recognition of something he'd suspected without being sure, a complicated mixture of gratitude and protectiveness that sat old on a 10-year-old's face. "It's you," Tom said, quiet so as not to wake his mother. Elias didn't move. "It is." "How long?" 4 weeks, nearly 5. Tom looked at the basket on the step. He looked at the man standing in the early dark in front of him, hat in his hands caught out like a boy stealing apples. Something in the boy's posture shifted, not softening exactly, more like a soldier standing down from a post he'd held alone for too long. "She doesn't know," Tom said. "No. You don't want her to." "I didn't want to embarrass her." Elias turned his hat brim in his hands. "Some people would rather go hungry than feel beholden. Your mother is one of those people. I respected it." Tom was quiet for a long moment. He looked past Elias at the dark street, checking it the way he'd probably checked it every morning for months, for Hollis, for creditors, for anyone who might show up with bad news, and no warning. Then he looked back. "I told Mama I'd shake your hand," he said. Elias held his hand out. Tom took it. His grip was firm, and he looked Elias straight in the eye while he shook the way a grown man shook hands, the way someone had taught him a handshake meant something and should be done right. "I'm going to tell her," Tom said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, clear and fair, giving Elias the knowledge in advance because the boy thought he deserved to have it. "Not today, but soon. She needs to know who to thank." "All right," Elias said. Tom picked up the basket and went inside. The door closed without a sound. Elias stood on the empty street in the dark and let out a long, slow breath that clouded white in the cold air. His hands had stopped shaking sometime during the handshake. He put his hat back on and walked to his horse. He was halfway home before it fully settled on him that the boy had looked at him without suspicion or resentment or any of the wariness a fatherless child in a hard situation had every right to carry. Tom Calloway had looked at him like a person who had made a decision about Elias Holt and was comfortable with it. And somehow, that was harder to carry than anything else that had happened in 5 weeks, because it meant something he hadn't let himself name yet was already further along than he'd acknowledged. Sunday service arrived, and Elias arrived with it early, as he'd been for weeks settled into his pew 3 rows from the front. The congregation filed in around him. The Callaways came in just before the opening hymn. Maggie first hand resting on Hank's shoulder. Tom a half step behind her, in the position he'd clearly adopted as his permanent post, slightly behind, and to his mother's right where he could see anyone approaching. When Tom came through the door, he looked directly at Elias's pew, found him without searching, gave one small nod so slight that no one else would have caught it, and then turned his attention forward. Elias faced front and stared at the pulpit, and did not feel anything manageable for the next several minutes. Reverend Cross preached on courage. Elias heard about half of it. What broke things open was not a dramatic moment. It was a quiet one, the kind that slides under your guard because you're watching for something larger. After the service in the yard, Hank Callaway escaped his mother's hand with the ease of a 6-year-old who has spent his whole life practicing exactly this maneuver, and ran 3 steps, and tripped on a root, and went down hard on both knees in the frozen dirt. He came up with bloody palms, and the particular expression of a small boy deciding in real time whether this was bad enough to cry about. Elias was the closest adult. He was already moving before he'd made the decision to move, crouching down in front of the boy, pulling his handkerchief from his coat pocket. "Let me see," he said. Hank held his palms out. The cuts were shallow, more shock than damage. Elias folded the handkerchief and pressed it firm. "Hold that," he said. "Both hands." Hank held it, examining Elias with the frank curiosity of a child who hasn't learned yet to pretend he's not looking at someone. "You're the big ranchman," Hank said. "I am. Tom knows you. We've met." Hank appeared to weigh this. "Do you have horses?" "Several. Real ones, not just carved ones." Something moved through Elias's chest. He kept his face steady. "Real ones. You could come see them sometime if your mother agreed." Hank lit up like someone had struck a match behind his eyes. Then Maggie was there, kneeling on Hank's other side, hands going to her son's face first and then to the handkerchief. She was so focused on Hank that she didn't look at Elias for a full 10 seconds. When she did, something crossed her face that he couldn't quite read: surprise recognition of a name she knew without knowing why she knew it, and then a careful, neutral settling of her expression. "Mr. Holt," she said. She'd learned his name from Walt Mercer, probably, or from the general shape of who was who in this town. "Mrs. Callaway." He stood, giving her the space to tend her son. "Thank you." She looked down at Hank's hands. "He doesn't look where he's going." "I see everything," Hank announced. "I just don't always stop for it." Maggie's face changed when he said that, a real smile, quick and involuntary, gone almost before it arrived. Elias saw it and looked away before she could catch him looking. Agnes Pruitt was watching from 12 feet away. He could feel it the way you feel a cold wind from a specific direction. He said a polite goodbye and walked to where his horse was tied. He was tightening the cinch when he became aware of Tom standing nearby, not quite beside him, giving him the dignity of not being approached too directly. "She doesn't know yet," Tom said quietly, same as before. "But she's been asking Walt Mercer things." "What kind of things? Who lives on what roads? Who might have reason to be out before sunrise?" A pause. "She's smart, Mr. Holt." "I know she is." "She'll figure it out herself if you don't tell her first." The boy looked at him with those old eyes. "And if she figures it out herself, she might take it harder. That's all I'm saying." Elias looked at the boy. "You're probably right." Tom nodded once, like that was settled, and went back to his mother. The letter from Cheyenne arrived Wednesday. Elias's lawyer had done what he'd asked: quiet, clean, no names attached to the transaction. The back rent on the Crane Street shack had been paid through an account that would take Hollis 6 months to trace back to anyone, if he bothered, which a man like Hollis generally didn't. The second letter Elias had mailed, the one he hadn't reread, had gone to a woman named Mrs. Ida Farnsworth in Laramie, who ran a respectable dress shop and needed a skilled seamstress and paid a living wage. He'd included a reference he had no right to write, strictly speaking, for a woman whose work he'd only seen in the precise folding of cloth and the sharp ironing of creases in a returned wicker basket. He'd written it anyway because he believed it, and because if Maggie Calloway ever wanted a way out of mending fringe work in a town that judged her, she deserved to have the door already open. Whether she walked through it was entirely her business. He was riding back from the east pasture that afternoon, the letter folded in his coat, when he came around the bend above town and saw her. Maggie was on the road below, walking with Hank's hand in hers, and a parcel of mending under her arm, heading back toward Crane Street. She walked the way she always walked, back straight, head level, the particular posture of a woman who has decided that dignity is the one thing no circumstance can remove unless you allow it. He could have turned off the road. She hadn't seen him yet. He kept riding down. She heard the horse and turned. He pulled up, touched his hat brim. Hank saw him and broke immediately into the unself-conscious smile of a child who has decided he likes you and sees no reason to hide it. "Mr. Holt," Hank announced as though delivering news. "We saw you at church." "You did." Elias looked at Maggie. "Mrs. Calloway." "Mr. Holt." Same careful, neutral face. But her eyes were doing something else, that searching thing he'd seen people do when they were working out a puzzle they almost had solved. "Can I trouble you to carry that parcel?" She blinked. "I manage fine, thank you." "I know you do." He said it simply, without condescension. "I've got a free hand, and you've got a full one, and the road is long. It's not charity. It's just company." A beat. Then she shifted the parcel and held it up toward him. He took it, and they walked, his horse following patient behind him, Hank running a few steps ahead and back and ahead again, the way small boys do when they have more energy than the situation requires. The silence between Elias and Maggie was the kind that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but was very full. After a while she said, "You've been kind to my boys." "Hank is easy to be kind to. Tom is—" He paused. "Tom is something else. That boy's going to be a remarkable man." Something moved across her face. "He already is," she said quietly. "He just doesn't know it yet." Another silence. Hank had found a stick and was conducting some private battle with it against a fence post. "Mr. Holt," Maggie said. She stopped walking. He stopped too. She turned to face him fully, and he saw it in her eyes. She knew. She'd worked it out, or Tom had told her, or some piece had clicked into place between Mercer's General Store and this road, but she knew. He could see it in the way she was looking at him. Not the face she showed Agnes Pruitt or Reverend Cross. The real one. "It was you," she said. Same words Tom had used. The same quiet. He didn't insult her by denying it. "Yes, ma'am." She stood very still. "How long?" "Close to 5 weeks." She looked at Hank, still fighting his private war with the fence post, and her throat moved. When she looked back, her eyes were bright with something she was holding back through visible effort. "Why?" "Because I saw you," he said. "And I had plenty, and you didn't, and that seemed like a problem I could do something about. You don't know me. I know more than you might think." He held her gaze steady. "I know you fold that cloth and scrub that basket every morning like it's something worth caring for. I know your oldest boy stands his ground when grown men raise their voices at his mother. I know your youngest has named every carved thing I've left him and treats them like they matter, because you've taught him that things given with care deserve care in return." He stopped. "I know what hunger looks like on a family that won't admit to it. I've known that since I was 8 years old." Her breath came out slow and unsteady. "People are talking. Let them. It affects me differently than it affects you. I know that too." He meant it. "I'm sorry for it. I handled it poorly. I should have found a cleaner way." She was quiet for a long moment. Hank had abandoned the fence post and was now examining something in the dirt with intense concentration, temporarily out of the conversation's orbit. "You paid Hollis," she said. He didn't answer. "I went to pay him Thursday," she said. "He told me it was settled. He wouldn't say by who." She looked at him steadily. "You would have refused if I'd offered directly." "Yes." She didn't soften it. "I would have." "I know." He shifted the parcel in his arm. "I wasn't trying to go around you, Mrs. Calloway. I was trying to give you one less wall to fight." She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. He'd learned patience from the land from cattle, from years of building something large out of something small, and he'd learned that the things worth having couldn't be hurried without breaking. "I don't know how to accept this," she said finally. Her voice was steady but thin at the edges. "I was raised that you earn what you have, and you don't take what you haven't earned. I was raised the same way." He met her eyes. "But I was also kept alive one winter by a sack of flour someone left on my mother's porch, with no note and no name. I spent 20 years not knowing how to carry that. Turns out the only way to carry it is to pass it forward." The bright thing in her eyes spilled over. She caught it fast, turned her face slightly recovered. When she looked back, she was composed, but the composure was a different kind than before. Not armor, just steadiness. "Tom said he shook your hand," she said. "He did." Firm grip. The real smile came then, quick and full, and completely unguarded, gone in a second, but real in a way that the careful expressions she showed the town never were. It hit him square in the chest and stayed there. "Mr. Holt." She reached out and he handed back the parcel, and she took it, and for one moment her fingers were close to his on the paper wrapping. "I don't know what to say to you." "You don't have to say anything." "That's not true." She held the parcel against her. "You came back after the talk started. You came back when it would have been easier not to." She looked at him. "That means something. I want you to know it means something." He nodded because his throat had tightened in a way that made words unreliable. Hank arrived between them, having completed his examination of whatever the dirt had offered. He looked up at Elias with the directness of a child who wants something and sees no reason not to ask for it. "Are you coming for supper?" "Hank?" Maggie's voice was gentle but firm. "He carried the mending," Hank pointed out. The logic seemed airtight to him. "People who carry things get supper. That's a rule." "That is not a rule." "It should be." Hank looked at Elias with solemn conviction. "Don't you think it should be?" Elias looked at the boy. He looked at Maggie, who was watching her son with the exhausted, fond expression of a woman who has learned that arguing with 6-year-old logic requires more energy than she always has. He looked at the road ahead and the light beginning to change toward evening. "Some other time, maybe," Elias said, "when the invitation comes from your mother." Hank accepted this with the philosophical ease of a child who has learned to take wins where he can find them. "Okay, but I'm going to ask her," he informed Elias as though delivering a promise. "So you should be ready." Elias touched his hat brim to Maggie. She met his eyes over her son's head. Something passed between them. Acknowledgement maybe, or the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet, but was real and present, and growing the way things grew when they were planted in good ground. He walked back to his horse. He mounted up. He didn't look back until he was 20 yards down the road, and when he did, she was already walking, Hank's hand back in hers, the parcel under her arm. She didn't turn around. But Tom, standing on the porch of the shack at the end of the street watching his mother come home, looked up and found Elias on the road above, and raised one hand in a gesture that was small and certain and unmistakably deliberate. Elias raised his hand back. Then he turned his horse toward home and rode into the changing light, carrying a feeling in his chest that was large and unfamiliar, and not entirely comfortable, and that he had absolutely no intention of putting down. The invitation came on a Saturday, delivered by Hank Calloway with the solemn efficiency of a child who has been entrusted with an important task and intends to perform it correctly. Elias was at the feed store loading grain sacks when he heard boots on the boardwalk behind him and turned to find Hank, standing at attention, with both hands clasped behind his back, and an expression of enormous dignity on his 6-year-old face. "Mr. Holt," Hank said, "Mama says, would you like to come to supper Sunday after church? She made me practice saying it right." He paused. "I practiced 4 times." Elias set down the grain sack. "It came out very well." "Thank you." Hank looked pleased. "She also said to tell you it's just a simple meal and you shouldn't expect anything grand. She said that part was important." He frowned slightly. "I don't know why. Food is food." "You tell your mother I'd be honored." Hank gave one firm nod, the mission accomplished, and turned and ran back down the boardwalk with the total abandon of a small boy freed from formality. Elias watched him go. Walt Mercer appeared in the feed store doorway with a look on his face that was carefully arranged into neutrality. "Not a word, Walt," Elias said. "Wasn't going to say a thing," Walt said, and went back inside. Elias finished loading the grain with a feeling in his chest that he chose not to examine too closely. Sunday dinner at the Calloway Shack was the finest meal Elias had eaten in years, and it had nothing to do with the food. Maggie had made a chicken stew from parts of a bird that cost her more than she could easily afford, and she'd stretched it with carrots and dried beans and a pan of cornbread that came out golden and even, and she'd set the crate table with the 2 mismatched plates she owned and 2 tin cups and a cracked bowl for the boys to share, and she'd put a sprig of dried sage in the middle of the table because she had no flowers, and the sage was what she had. Elias sat across from her in the one chair that wasn't a crate and ate his stew and said it was the best he'd had and meant it completely, and watched her absorb the compliment the way she absorbed most things offered directly to her, with a brief complicated expression that cycled through resistance and gratitude, and settled somewhere in the vicinity of grace. Tom sat straight and ate carefully and spoke when spoken to, with a precision that reminded Elias of a much older person. Hank talked without cease about thunder and hope and a third carved creature he had decided he needed, which he described in detail, a dog, a big one, maybe brown with ears that go like this, while illustrating with his hands in a way that sent cornbread crumbs across the table. "Hank," Maggie said. "He asked what I wanted." Hank said reasonably. He was being polite. He didn't necessarily require a full description. "I didn't mind the description," Elias said. Hank pointed at him. "See?" Maggie's mouth pressed together against the smile. She lost the battle briefly. That quick full smile appeared and disappeared, and Elias looked down at his bowl before she could catch him watching for it. After supper, the boys cleared the dishes with the practiced efficiency of children who'd been doing their share since before they were really big enough, and Maggie made coffee on the small stove, and they sat across the crate table from each other, while Tom read to Hank in the curtained corner, the boy's voice low and careful, sounding out the harder words. "He taught himself most of it," Maggie said quietly, nodding toward Tom. "James, my husband, he'd started with him before the accident. Tom just kept going on his own after." "He's got a good mind," Elias said. "He gets it from James." She wrapped both hands around her tin cup. "James read everything he could get hold of. Used to say a man who didn't read was only living half a life." She paused. "I always felt ashamed of that. That I couldn't, that I never learned properly." She said it the way she said everything difficult, straight out, no softening. "There's nothing shameful in it. Schools weren't built for everyone, and life didn't leave much room. I know that in my head." She looked at the cup. "It feels different from inside." "I could teach you," he said. It came out simpler than he'd intended, no preamble. "If you wanted. Tom's been teaching himself. No reason you couldn't do the same with some help." She looked at him. The careful, neutral expression held for a moment, then shifted into something more uncertain. "Why do you keep doing that?" "Doing what?" offering things. Her voice was steady, but not comfortable. Every time I find an edge of something, I'm ashamed of you. She stopped, started again. I don't know what to do with someone who does that, Mr. Holt. I don't have practice with it. He was quiet for a moment. Neither do I, he said honestly. I've been on my own a long time. I'm probably doing it badly. She looked at him for a long moment. Some calculation was happening behind her eyes that he couldn't quite follow, but he'd learned by now not to rush her. She did things in her own time and her own order, and any attempt to hurry that would be both unsuccessful and wrong. Elias, she said, using his name for the first time, testing it the way someone tests ice before they put their full weight down. I want to say something and I need you to hear it plainly. All right. I'm not looking to be saved. She met his eyes. I know how it looks. I know what people think when they see a widow with 2 boys and a back rent problem and a man bringing food before sunrise. I know what story they're telling about me in Agnes Pruitt's parlor, and I need you to know that I am not that story. She paused. I was managing. Barely, and it was hard, and I was scared more than I let my boys see. But I was managing. I would have kept managing. I know that, he said. Do you? Yes. He didn't hedge it or qualify it. I didn't leave those baskets because I thought you couldn't survive without them. I left them because I had plenty, and you had nothing, and that's not a thing I can see and do nothing about. It wasn't about saving you. He held her gaze. It was about not being the kind of man who rides past. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and texture. From the curtained corner, Tom's voice moved through a sentence quiet and careful, and Hank repeated a word after him. The letter from Laramie, Maggie said. He'd wondered when this would come. You know about that. Ida Farnsworth wrote me directly. She said a mutual friend had spoken highly of my work. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite amusement, and not quite exasperation, and something in between. I don't have any mutual friends with a dress shop owner in Laramie. You do now. Elias. His name again firm this time. You wrote her a reference for work you've never seen. I've seen the way you fold cloth. He said it simply. I've seen the way you mend your boys' clothes, every patch precise, every seam reinforced. I've seen what you do with materials that have nothing left in them. That tells me what I need to know about your work. He looked at her. I wasn't wrong, was I? She opened her mouth, closed it. The almost smile crossed her face and disappeared again. No, she admitted. You weren't wrong. I wasn't trying to decide your life for you, he said. The letter was just a door. You walk through it or you don't. That's entirely yours. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, It's a good position. Better than anything available here. She turned the tin cup slowly. Laramie's 3 days by wagon. I know where Laramie is. She looked at him. Why would you help me get to a position 3 days' travel from here? It was a fair question. It was the question he'd been asking himself for 2 weeks ever since he'd written the letter. The honest answer was that he'd written it before things had shifted between them, or before he'd admitted to himself that they had shifted, and by the time he'd understood what he was actually doing, the letter was already mailed. He'd told himself it was because she deserved options. That was true. The full truth was more complicated. Because you deserve to have the choice, he said, wherever you end up choosing. She studied him with those direct eyes that missed very little. He held the gaze and didn't look away, and didn't offer anything more, because he'd learned that with Maggie Calloway, offering too much too fast caused her to step back, and he was done watching her step back from him. I haven't written back to her yet, Maggie said finally. I'm still thinking. Take all the time you need. From the corner, Hank had apparently finished being read to, and had fallen asleep against Tom's shoulder, the carved horse still in his fist. Tom looked over at his mother with an expression of patient tolerance that was extremely adult for a 10-year-old and slightly cross-eyed from trying to look at Hank and his mother at the same time. He's out, Tom said. I see that. Maggie set her cup down. I'll come. It's all right. He's not heavy. Tom adjusted his brother's weight with the ease of someone who'd done it before. He glanced at Elias and then back at his mother with an expression that was almost diplomatic. You don't have to stop on my account. Maggie looked at her son. Tom looked at the curtain. Elias looked at the table and kept his face in order. Thomas Calloway, Maggie said. Ma'am? Tom said. A pause. Thank you for your consideration, she said, and the dryness in her voice had warmth underneath it. Yes, ma'am, Tom said, and looked back at his book. Elias walked home in the cold that evening and stood in his barn for a while in the quiet before going in. He had a feeling that the particular solitude of the ranch, the kind he'd grown so accustomed to that he'd stopped noticing it had become visible to him again in the last weeks. The way an absence only becomes visible when you've had a glimpse of what could fill it. The empty dining room, the one place set at the long table, the silence that didn't have children in it. He wasn't a man who fooled himself. He knew what he felt, and he knew it was serious, and he knew that the next step, if there was one, required something from him that he hadn't offered anyone in 6 years. Not supplies or money or references or carved horses. Something harder. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the form of Owen Hollis on a Tuesday morning. Elias was at the post office when he heard raised voices from the direction of Crane Street, and something in the quality of the sound, not anger exactly, something sharper and more unstable than ordinary anger, made him change direction. He came around the corner to find Hollis on the Calloway porch with 2 men behind him, none of whom Elias recognized, and all 3 of them carrying the particular posture of men who have decided they are in the right and don't intend to be argued with. Maggie stood in the doorway. Tom was in front of her, which was his position slightly ahead, and to the right, the one he'd apparently decided was his, and maintained without being asked. Rent's settled, Maggie was saying. Her voice was controlled but thin. You told me yourself it was settled. You have no cause to be here. Rent's settled for what it was, Hollis said. He was a heavy man, not tall, with the manner of someone who had spent years using money to avoid developing patience. Doesn't mean the arrangement continues. I've had a better offer for this property. You've got until end of week. End of the week. Tom's voice came out flat and dangerous, in a way that was startling from a 10-year-old. That's 5 days. Boy. One of the men behind Hollis started. He's right, Maggie said, and her voice had dropped to something quieter and more controlled, which Elias had learned was more alarming than raised. 5 days is not sufficient notice under any agreement, verbal or written. You gave us 2 weeks when it suited you. You'll give us no less now. Hollis's face reddened. I don't take terms from a widow, Maggie said. No, from a tenant with legal right to proper notice. That's different. You don't have anything in writing. Neither do you, which means we operate by the standard of the territory. She held his gaze. She did not step back from the doorway. 2 weeks, Mr. Hollis. That is what we will accept. Hollis looked at the woman in the doorway and the boy in front of her and calculated something. Then he looked past them both and saw Elias standing at the edge of the porch, hat in hand, having arrived quietly enough that nobody had noticed yet. The calculation on Hollis's face changed. Holt, he said. Not friendly. Hollis. Elias kept his voice easy. Didn't know you had business here this morning. Private matter. But Hollis's posture had shifted the way men's postures shifted around Elias, whether they intended it or not. Seems like it's mostly settled. Elias looked at the 2 men behind Hollis without particular expression, the kind of look that said he'd measured them and found them unremarkable. Mrs. Calloway's right about the territory standard. 2 weeks is what she's owed. He paused. I'd take that as settled if I were you. The silence stretched. Hollis looked between Elias and the doorway. He looked at his 2 men who were looking at Elias with an attention that suggested they were no longer certain about the morning's calculations. 2 weeks, Hollis said. He said it like he was granting something rather than conceding, but he said it. He stepped off the porch. His men followed. They went down the street without looking back. Maggie let out a breath. Elias heard it from the porch steps. Tom turned from the street and looked at his mother, and then at Elias, and something passed through the boy's face that was too layered for his age relief and pride, and something more complicated underneath. "Thank you," Maggie said to Elias. Her voice had come back to its full strength. "You'd already handled it." "Not entirely." She looked at him steadily. 2 weeks isn't enough." "No." He came up the porch steps. He kept his voice low. "It isn't, but I've been thinking about that." He looked at her and at Tom beside her, and chose the words he'd been arranging and rearranging for the better part of a week. "I have empty rooms. I have more space than one man uses. Clara Webb runs my household, and she's been working half days when she should be working full because there isn't enough to fill her hours." Maggie was very still. "I'm not talking about charity," he said before she could. "I know that word is one you won't hear. I'm talking about an arrangement that makes practical sense. Clara needs help. My ranch needs life in it. You need a roof and stability for your boys." He paused. "And he stopped. Started again. "I would like you close enough to see more of." The last part came out quieter than the rest. She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a great deal to offer a woman you've known 6 weeks." "I'm aware of that." "People will talk worse than they already have." "I know it. And you don't care." She said it not as a challenge, but as a genuine question, trying to understand the mechanism of a man who appeared to mean what he said, which was not a thing she'd encountered often enough to take on faith without examination. "I care that it affects you," he said honestly. "I don't care what it does to how people see me. Those are different things." He held her gaze. "What people think of me was built over 30 years, and it'll hold. What matters is what's true. And what's true is that your boys are too thin, and your landlord is standing on your porch with hired men, and the town's opinion of you is being shaped by people who don't know the first thing about your character." He stopped. "I know your character. I'd like the chance to know more of it." Tom had moved slightly, not closer to his mother this time, slightly apart, which was different. The boy was giving them room. He was watching Hollis's retreating figure down the street with his hands in his pockets and his back mostly turned, and the deliberateness of it was not lost on anyone. Maggie looked at her son's back. She looked at the street where Hollis had gone. She looked at Elias with the full direct force of her attention, which was considerable. "Hank would want to see the horses," she said. "I know he would. Tom would need space of his own. He doesn't do well without some quiet to himself. There's a room at the far end of the house, separate, doesn't share a wall with anything." She held both hands together in front of her. He could see her working through it, not the question of whether she trusted him, he thought, but the harder question of whether she trusted herself to accept something good without losing the thing inside her that had kept them alive all this time. "I'm not going to become a burden," she said. The words came out with an edge not aimed at him, but at some audience she carried. "I'll work my share and more. I'll write to Ida Farnsworth and decline and find other work. Real work, not charity dressed in different clothes. Maggie." He said her name for the first time, and it stopped her. "I know all of that. I'm not asking for anything other than what I said." He looked at her. "Come see the rooms. Bring the boys. Make your own judgment." She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was changing around them, the cold settling in the way it did when the sun started to drop, and somewhere down the street a horse shifted and a door closed, and ordinary life went on around them, while they stood on a porch in the middle of something that neither of them had the right language for yet. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday's fine." She nodded once. She turned to go inside, then paused with her hand on the door frame and turned back. "The stew last Sunday," she said. "You said it was the best you'd had." "I did." "Was that true, or were you being polite?" "Mrs. Calloway." He said, "I have never been polite in my life." The quick, full smile came, and this time she didn't suppress it, and this time he didn't look away. It lasted 3 full seconds, which he counted, and then she went inside, and the door closed, and he stood on the empty porch with the cold coming in around him, and the feeling in his chest that was large and warm and entirely ungovernable. Tom's voice came through the closed door, and then Hank's voice louder, and then the sound of something small and wooden clattering on a floor, and Hank's high, bright laugh following it. The sounds of a household of children, of a life being lived in rooms too small for it, pressing against the walls. Elias stepped off the porch. He walked to his horse. Grady was waiting at the ranch when he got back, leaning on the fence with his hat pulled down, which meant he'd been there a while. "Well," the old man said. "Saturday," Elias said. Grady straightened up. He looked at his employer with the expression of a man who has watched a long winter finally decide to end. "Well," he said. "All right then." He pushed off the fence and walked toward the bunkhouse. Then he stopped and turned. "Clara's going to want to clean those rooms. Tell her she has until Saturday. She'll have them cleaned by Thursday and clean them again Friday," Grady said. "Just so you know." He walked on. Elias stood with his horse in the late light and felt the ranch around him, the barns, the pasture, the long empty house, and for the first time in 6 years it felt like something other than a testament to what he'd built and a reminder of what he hadn't. It felt like it was waiting, same as him. Saturday arrived the way important days often do, quietly, without announcement, dressed in ordinary clothes. Clara Webb had cleaned the 2 spare rooms on Thursday, as Grady predicted, and cleaned them again on Friday, and on Saturday morning, she cleaned the kitchen twice, and rearranged the dishes in the cupboard, and then rearranged them back to where they'd been. Elias watched this from the doorway and said nothing. Grady had told him to say nothing, and Grady was right about most things. The Callaways arrived mid-morning in the thin winter light, Maggie walking with her back straight, and her hands clasped in front of her, Tom beside her, carrying the single bag they'd brought. Hank 3 steps ahead of everyone because Hank could not physically walk at adult pace when there was anything in the world to move toward. He'd been told there were horses. He had understood this as a directive. Elias met them at the gate. Hank stopped in front of him with both hands on his hips and looked at the ranch with the expression of a person whose expectations have been confirmed and then exceeded. "It's big," he announced. "It is." Tom said it was big. "I thought he was making it bigger in the telling." Hank looked at his brother. "You weren't." "I generally don't," Tom said. Maggie stood at the gate and looked at the house, the real house, 2 stories solid and square, smoke coming from 2 chimneys, and Elias watched her face do the thing it did when she was taking in something she was trying not to react to. The careful settling. The composed surface held in place by will. "Come in," he said. "Clara's been cooking since dawn, and she'll be insulted if we stand out here in the cold." Clara met them at the door with the barely contained energy of a woman who has been waiting for company for years and was determined not to appear as though she had been. She shook Maggie's hand and looked at the boys with the direct assessment of someone who liked children and didn't see the need to pretend otherwise. "You're Tom," she said to Tom. "Yes, ma'am." "Your mother speaks well of you." She looked at Hank. "And you must be the one with the horses." Hank's eyes went wide. "How did you know?" "Because you've looked at the barn 4 times since you came through the gate, and you haven't looked at the house once." Clara opened the door wider. "Come in. There's food first and then horses. That's the order of things." Hank came inside. He looked at the food on the kitchen table, biscuits and preserves and sliced ham and a pot of coffee and a smaller pot of hot cider, and appeared to briefly reconsider his priorities. Then he sat down. Maggie stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room with its full shelves and its warm stove and its table set for 5. And Elias watched her take one slow breath that was doing more work than a breath should have to do. Then she came in and sat down and accepted the cup Clara handed her and held it in both hands, and the morning proceeded. Tom ate carefully and watched everything with those steady measuring eyes, cataloging the house the way he cataloged most things, quietly, thoroughly, without tipping his hand. At one point, Clara refilled his cider without asking, and he said thank you with a precision that made her pause and look at him with something close to respect. "Your mother teach you your manners?" Clara asked. "Yes, ma'am. And my father." "Your father taught you well." "He did." Tom said it simply, without the weight some boys put into speaking of dead fathers. Just a fact honored by being stated plainly. After breakfast, Clara took Hank to the barn. He left the table at a pace that technically still counted as walking if you were being generous about it. Tom followed, slightly more measured, and Elias noted the exact moment when Tom came through the barn door and saw the horses, and the measuredness dissolved for just a second into something that was simply a boy seeing something wonderful. He recovered it quickly, which made it more touching, not less. That left Elias and Maggie in the kitchen. She stood at the window, cup in her hands, looking out at the barn where Clara could be heard introducing Hank to a mare named Butterscotch with the seriousness of a formal introduction. "He's going to want to live in that barn," Maggie said. "Barn's warm enough." Elias came to stand nearby, not crowding her. "Clara would adopt him outright if you let her." "I noticed." She turned from the window. Her face was doing the complicated thing, the one that cycled through feelings too quickly for him to name each one. "She's a good woman. The best I know." Maggie set her cup on the table. She looked at him directly, the way she did when she'd decided something and was going to say it straight out, regardless of the cost. He'd come to recognize this look and to respect it absolutely. "I need to ask you something," she said. "And I need you to answer me honestly, even if the honest answer is uncomfortable." "All right." "What is this?" She held his gaze steady. "Not the rooms, not the practical arrangement. I understand the practical arrangement. I mean..." She paused, choosing. "What are you doing, Elias? What do you actually want from this?" The question sat between them. He'd known it was coming. He'd known since the Sunday supper with the tin cups and the dried sage and Hank's cornbread crumbs that eventually she would ask it directly, because Maggie Calloway did not let important things stay undefined when she had the means to define them. He'd spent 2 weeks preparing an answer that was careful and measured, and left her room to retreat if she needed to. He didn't give that answer. "I want to stop eating supper alone," he said. "I want those boys in this house. I want Tom to have books enough to last him years and space enough to think in. I want Hank to learn to ride on a real horse instead of a carved one." He paused. "And I want to know you. All of it. The parts you show and the parts you don't. I want to sit on that porch on summer evenings and hear what you think about things. I want to watch you grow a garden in that ground out there that's been going to waste since Clara won't garden, and I don't have the patience for it." She was very still. "I know that's more than you asked for," he said. "I know 6 weeks is not a long time. I know your husband is barely a year in the ground, and I know you're not looking to be saved, and I know you'll be managing with or without me." He looked at her. "But I'm asking you to consider not managing alone. Not because you can't, because you shouldn't have to." The silence was the long kind. Outside, Hank's voice carried from the barn bright and clear, asking Clara if Butterscotch liked carrots and whether she'd ever gone fast. Clara's answer was inaudible, but the tone was warm. "My husband," Maggie said. Her voice had gone quieter. "James was a good man. He was gentle, and he was patient, and he loved his boys, and he loved me as well as he knew how." She turned her cup on the table. "He died doing honest work for a dishonest wage, and I have been angry about that every day for 11 months, and I haven't told anyone." She looked up. "I'm telling you now because you asked for the parts I don't show, and that's one of them." "I hear you," he said. "I don't want to replace him." She said it firm, not apologetically. "I don't want a man who's trying to be his version. I want..." She stopped. Something moved through her face. "I want to know what it feels like to not be afraid," she said. "I've been afraid every morning for 11 months. What we'll eat, what we'll owe, what I'll tell the boys when the answer to both questions is nothing. I wake up afraid and I go to sleep afraid, and I hold it together in the middle because they need me to." Her voice stayed level throughout all of this, which was the most remarkable thing about it. "I don't know what not being afraid feels like anymore." Elias crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her and said, "Then let me show you." She looked up at him. The careful surface was entirely gone. What was underneath it was a woman who had been strong for so long that she'd almost forgotten she was allowed to be anything else, and who was standing at the exact edge of choosing differently. "I'm not easy," she said. "I know. I have opinions, strong ones. I'll argue with you when I think you're wrong. I'd expect nothing less. My boys are part of whatever this is. There's no version of my life where they're not the first thing. They're part of why I want this," he said. "Not in spite of them. Because of them. Tom and Hank are part of what you are, and what you are is what I—" He stopped, steadied. "What I want to know better, all three of you." She looked at him for a long moment. He did not move, and did not rush her, and did not offer anything more, because she had everything she needed to make her decision, and adding more would be noise. "All right," she said. Quiet and plain and final. He let the words settle. "All right," he said back. They stood in the kitchen in the winter light, and nothing dramatic happened, which was entirely right, because the real things in life seldom happened dramatically. They happened quietly in kitchens between two people who had stopped pretending they didn't need what they needed. They brought the boys inside for lunch and told them together. Elias let Maggie lead it because they were her sons, and it was her news to give. She sat them at the table and told them they'd be moving to the ranch. She said it clearly, and without decoration, in the way she did everything that mattered. Tom looked at his plate. Then he looked at Elias. "Is that all right with you?" he asked, which was not the question Elias had expected. "It was my idea," Elias said. "I know." Tom's eyes didn't waver. "I'm asking if we'll be all right with you, the three of us, because Mama's had enough of things not being all right." The kitchen went very quiet. Elias looked at this 10-year-old boy who had stood between his mother and landlords and carried his brother and rationed his own food without being asked, and decided to shake a stranger's hand because he'd decided the stranger was worth it. He looked at him and gave him the full truth. "I will spend every day making sure of it," he said. "You have my word." Tom looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded once, the same small certain nod from the church steps, and picked up his fork. Hank, who had been waiting with visible difficulty to see how the important conversation came out, immediately turned to Elias and said, "Can I name one of the horses?" "Hank," Maggie said. "The horses already have names," Elias said. "But there's a colt coming in the spring that doesn't have one yet." Hank's expression became the expression of a child receiving exactly what he had hoped for, and not being entirely sure how to contain it. He pressed his lips together very hard. Then he said with enormous gravity, "I'll need time to think about it." "Take all the time you need," Elias said. They were married 3 weeks later. Not quietly, as it turned out, or not in the way Elias had imagined when he'd thought about something small and simple. What happened was that the morning Reverend Cross was set to perform the ceremony, he arrived at the church to find it half full already. Walt Mercer and his wife. Grady Sims cleaned up in a way that suggested Clara Webb had issued directives. Clara herself in her best dress, sitting in the front pew with Hank between her and the aisle, because she'd recognized immediately that Hank needed to be beside someone who would keep him from climbing the pew. Agnes Pruitt was there. She sat near the back, and she did not look triumphant or gossipy, or any of the things Elias might have expected. She looked like a woman who had spent a month thinking about things and was still in the middle of the process. When she caught Elias's eye, she gave a small nod that cost her something. He returned it. Tom walked his mother up the aisle. He'd asked to. Maggie had looked at her son when he asked and pressed her lips together and then said yes. And on the morning it happened, he wore his best clothes and his father's straight posture and his own solemn, careful pride, and he gave his mother's hand to Elias with the gravity of a person performing a sacred transfer. Elias took it. He looked at Maggie in her dress that Clara had helped alter, a blue wool dress not borrowed, bought from Mercer's at cost because Walt had quietly declined to charge full price, and thought about every morning he'd ridden back roads before dawn with a basket of eggs and flour and the specific hope that it was enough. It had not been enough, not by itself, but it had been the beginning of enough, and that he understood now was all any beginning had to be. "Do you take this woman?" Reverend Cross said. "I do," Elias said. He meant the two words with everything he had. The reception was held in the church hall because Clara had organized it, and Clara did not do things by halves. There was food more than Elias had sanctioned, and he suspected several women had contributed dishes without being asked, and Hank ate until Maggie cut him off and then went back for more when she was talking to someone else, which Tom observed without intervening, because Tom had apparently decided that some battles were not his. Grady shook Elias's hand at the door going out. The old man held on a moment longer than a handshake strictly required. "You done good, boss," he said. That was all. It was enough. The first evening in the ranch house, Elias sat on the porch after supper in the cold, clear dark, while inside Clara and Maggie washed dishes and talked in the easy way of women who have decided they like each other. And Tom sat at the kitchen table with a book propped against the sugar jar, and Hank was theoretically in bed, but could be heard through his window conducting a conversation with the carved horse and the carved bird about what the colt would be named in spring. The front door opened, and Maggie came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him on the bench he'd built against the wall. She handed him a cup. He took it. They sat in the dark and drank their coffee, and listened to the ranch settle into night around them. The cattle in the far pasture, the horses in the barn, the wind off the plain moving through the bare trees at the fence line. Inside, Tom turned a page. Hank's voice dropped to a murmur, and then went quiet, which meant he'd fallen asleep mid-sentence the way he always did. "He's out," Maggie said, nodding toward the window. "Figured. He was fading at supper." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Elias?" "I'm not afraid this morning." She said it like a discovery, which it was. "I woke up, and I waited for it, the fear, the arithmetic, the count of what we had against what we owed. And it wasn't there." She paused. "I don't know what to do with that yet." He looked at her. Her profile in the dark, the set of her shoulders, the way she held her cup, not braced against anything for the first time in as long as he'd known her. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "It's just what things are now." She turned to look at him. Her eyes in the dark had that particular quality of seeing him straight. No edges softened the full force of her attention. He'd come to understand that being looked at by Maggie Calloway was one of the few things in the world he'd never be entirely steady under. He suspected this would remain true for the rest of his life. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the baskets, not for the rent, not for the rooms." She held his gaze. "For coming back. Every time it would have been easier to stop, you came back. I was always going to come back," he said. "I know that now." She leaned her shoulder against his. "I didn't know it then, but I know it now." They sat together on the bench he'd built for 2 people, without admitting that was why he'd built it in the dark of the Wyoming plain, with their coffee and the cold and the ranch sleeping around them. And inside the house, Tom's page turning and Hank's dreaming silence, and Clara's lamp glowing warm in the kitchen window, like a signal, like a hearth, like the oldest human proof that shelter is not just wood and stone, but the people who choose to stay inside it together. Some months later, in the first real warmth of spring, Hank Calloway stood at the fence of the near pasture, with both arms hooked over the top rail, and looked at the colt that had arrived in March, long-legged and uncertain, and inclined to startle at his own shadow, and announced his decision. "Brave," he said. Tom beside him considered this. That's his whole name. That's his whole name. Hank looked at his brother with perfect confidence. Because he came out scared of everything, and he's getting over it. He looked back at the colt. That's what brave is. You're scared, and you do it anyway. He paused. Mama said that. Tom looked at the colt. He looked at the ranch around them, the barns, the pasture, the house with smoke coming from both chimneys, their mother visible through the kitchen window, moving between the stove and the table, Elias coming up from the south field on his horse with his hat pushed back and one hand raised when he saw the boys at the fence. Tom raised his hand back. Brave's a good name, he said. Maggie appeared on the porch with her hands on the rail and called out that supper was nearly ready, and the sound of her voice crossed the yard clear and unafraid, the voice of a woman who had come through the worst of things and arrived finally at a life that was entirely and completely her own, chosen, earned, and held in the hands of people who understood exactly what it was worth. Elias rode through the gate and swung down and handed his horse to Grady and walked toward the house and his wife and the boys coming off the fence to race each other to the porch, and the ranch received all of them, the noise and the motion and the life of it, like ground that had been waiting for rain. This was not a rescue. It was not a charity. It was not a widow saved by a wealthy man's generosity, and anyone who told it that way told it wrong. It was two people who had both been surviving in their different ways, choosing to stop surviving and start living instead. It was a woman who never stopped being strong, finding that strength and tenderness were not opposites. It was a man who had filled 300 acres with everything except what mattered, discovering in a basket and a violet and a child's handshake. What mattered was never the acreage at all. And it was two boys who had gone to sleep hungry more times than anyone should, who grew up knowing in the marrow of their bones that the world contained genuine goodness, not because life was easy, but because the right people had refused to look away. That knowledge, planted in them in the hardest winter of their young lives, would outlast everything. It would outlast the ranch and the cold and the gossip of small towns. It would travel forward with them into their own lives, into the families they would one day build, into every moment they would face something hard and remember without having to think about it that coming back was always the right choice. Some things once given with a whole heart do not end. They simply travel further than the giver ever imagined and go on doing their work long after the basket is empty and the morning is gone, and all that remains is the warmth of a lamp in a window and the absolute unshakable certainty that home is real, love is earned, and neither one ever arrives without courage leading the way.